I am James Davison Hunter. I'm the author of Democracy and Solidarity on the Cultural Roots of America's Political Crisis, and you are listening to the Dr. Sky Experience on Talk Radio 77 WABC.
Welcome back to the Dr. Sky Experience, heard exclusively here on Talk Radio 77 WABC. We like to call it the crown jewel of radio, the iconic 77 Talk Radio WABC, beaming out of New York City, the nation, the world, and the cosmos. As many of our listeners may know, and for newcomers, we also mention, we talk about the great subject of astronomy, space, aviation, and weather, mixed in with great stories of American exceptionalism and celebrity guests in the mix. And today, ladies and gentlemen, a very special guest with such a timely topic and subject. In just a moment, we'll be introducing Dr. James Davison Hunter, his brand new book from Yale Press, Democracy and Solidarity on the Cultural Roots of America's Political Crisis. But the background of our special guest is in order. Dr. James Davison Hunter is a LaBrasse Levinson Distinguished Professor of Religion, Culture, and Social Theory and Executive Director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. His books include The Popular Culture Wars and Science and the Good. Doctor, welcome to this very interesting discussion on a very interesting book that I can find very much in need for people to read today, knowing what's going on not only here in America, but around the world. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Privilege and honor. And I want to mention, too, and I'm reading this so the audience can get a little better background on you before we actually get into the meat of the book. Dr. James Davison Hunter, who introduced the concept of culture wars 30 years ago, tells us in his new book that those historic sources of national solidarity now largely dissolved. While the deepening political polarization is most obvious sign of this, the true problem is not polarization per se, but the absence of cultural resources to work through what divides us. The logic that it's filled the void only makes bridging our differences more challenging in the end. And finally, all political regimes require some level of unity, not be generated organically. It will be then imposed by force. Talk to us about the epic book that, well, it's an honor to have a man who actually coined the term cultural wars. You were way ahead of your time, Doctor. I mean, what? In 1992, you wrote this book. So describe the origins of that book, and as we define it, please define for us culture wars in case people out there have no clue what we're talking about today.
Sure. So in the late 1980s, I began to notice a change in our political culture. For most of the 20th century, political conflict, the conflict between left and right, was a conflict that operated within the framework of political economy. It was a class conflict. It was the conflict between corporate interests and the interests of labor unions, between the managerial class and the working class. That was really the definition of political conflict for the most part through the better part of the 20th century. But by the last quarter of the 20th century, we began to see a redefinition of that conflict. Left and right were now being defined according to certain cultural issues, like abortion, like gay rights, funding for controversial arts at the National Endowment for the Arts, and so on. I mean, lots of these issues. The battle over the celebration of Christopher Columbus. These kinds of things were not merely symbolic. They were deeply divisive. And though they were presented in the media as though they were discrete, separate, independent issues, I began to see a pattern in the ways in which left and right and these conflicts were taking shape. So culture wars was an attempt to make sense of this transition in our political culture. And I've been studying this now for over 3 decades. This book, in a way, is the bookend to culture wars. It's the sort of culminating statement now over 3 decades later about what's going on, how it has evolved, and where it came from. I take a slightly different perspective, though, and I can tell you about that next, if you'd like.
No, I find this fascinating. So in my world, I mean, trying to do summaries, and obviously in the theater of the mind and radio here, would you then agree with me, or I will agree with you, that culture wars can be basically summed up as conflict between what? Different social groups. Is that simply the shortest answer possible? That is accurate. What say you on that?
No. I mean, there's conflict between social groups happens all the time and over many different things. But what creates this conflict is a conflict over competing cultural systems, worldviews, if you like, deep, abiding values and beliefs and ideas. This is, conflict over, say, economic issues. How much control should the government have over the redistribution of wealth? That's not, I mean, there's a big part of that that's cultural, but it's not only a question of cultural issues like abortion and like sexuality and the like. It is conflict that comes out of our deepest beliefs and the source of those beliefs.
Yes. This is fascinating. And if I go back into historical side, I'd like your commentary on this, and I hope I pronounced the German word correctly. Kulturkampf, a cultural struggle, as we people look into historical side, it looks like there was a 7-year political conflict, say around 1878 to 1870s, I should say, between the Catholic Church and Otto von Bismarck. Would you look at that as maybe one of the first identifiable areas where culture wars really was embedded into society, or have there been so many that the list would go on forever?
Well, culture wars are different in scale, but that's actually, I can't really claim credit for the concept of culture wars. It really does come from Bismarck. And the concept of Kulturkampf was a concept used back in the 1870s in Germany at the time when there was an effort to unify the Catholic South with the Protestant North. And again, it was a Kulturkampf because at stake were fundamentally different worldviews and different values and the sources of authority that animated those beliefs, values, and ideas. And it was a conflict like ours that was deeply symbolic, but because culture wars often precede shooting wars, it too turned to violence at times.
How sad, right? You know, folks, it's amazing. We have special guests on the Dr. Sky Experience, and we're privileged and honored to have a very special guest and author, Dr. James Davison Hunter. His brand new book from Yale Press, entitled simply Democracy and Solidarity, The Cultural Roots of America's Political Crisis. How important, Doctor, to times like we have today, in which, in your mind, I mean, how would you summarize, if you were to ask to prioritize some of these different areas that there's great, dissatisfaction or non-agreement on? I mean, we talk about abortion, gun control. How would you prioritize in America today, as we're in this very, politicized election year here? What would say you? I mean, what's the number 1, 2, or 3 issues that you see out there is relating to this book that people really need to understand and have hopefully cooler heads, use some critical thinking to maybe solve the problems instead of going to violence?
Well, first of all, I think that one of the things that's happened over the last 3 decades is that the cultural conflict has spread to pretty much all areas. I even read a story in the New York Times about the culture war surrounding dog walking. I've read stories about the culture war in gardening. It's really kind of bizarre. But it's important to point out that the culture war is not simply about the politics of certain cultural issues. It is that. But it's also much deeper than that. Again, it is about the fundamental beliefs and ideas and values, and even more than that, our deepest dispositions, our understanding of the nature of reality itself that is at stake. One of the things that surprised me in recent years was our reaction to the pandemic. You know, I speak about negative solidarity and affirmative solidarity. We came together as a nation in 2001 for a brief time in reaction to the bombing of the World Trade Centers,
exactly,
and the Pentagon, but it only lasted for a short period. I was under, and again, that's a negative solidarity. We come together in opposition to that which is attacking us. I thought the context of a global pandemic would bring the nation together, and silly me, this global pandemic that threatened and indeed took the lives of millions of people failed to bring us together. It in fact became yet another source of conflict. So
you're absolutely right.
Yes. Yeah. So again, the conflict that I'm talking about is certainly about certain cultural issues that range widely, but more deeply, more profoundly, it is about the cultural systems, the worldviews, the cosmologies, to use a more philosophical term, that divide us. We live on the same planet, but in fact, we inhabit different universes.
You're so well said. You're right. And it seems like that, the tip of the spear now. I mean, just watching mainstream or legacy media, which I may not always agree with, nor would you. We all have our opinions on this. It just seems like it's this knee-jerk reaction stimulus every day. We're hearing bad news, bad news, bad news. People, of course, are suffering in their own way. And obviously, we're trying to, hopefully, through interviews like this, try to find some, solutions to these problems. But let me ask you this straight up. Would you look at the concept of critical thinking as being severely missing in much of the dialogue that we're talking about here today? I mean, I remember back in my college days, that was something very interesting. By the way, I went to Catholic schools with Jesuit, priests and instructors. Yeah, I mean, that was an interesting experience. Not always perfect, of course. But what would you say about the concept of critical thinking missing in every aspect of our lives today, and including the whole political regime?
Well, I think sociologically and psychologically, we human beings are more oriented to and defined by conformity rather than independence. I think concepts like critical thinking have become slogans and not realities. I think in the educational world, there is a lot of groupthink where we have biases and then we just look for the data that support our biases. So true independent thinking, true critical thinking is pretty rare in this country. And I would say it's rare in higher education, certainly in public education. So,
well, if the golden rule ruled the roost, obviously that's a pretty simple thing to say with lots of positivity on my side, and I'm sure yours. But we're trying to, navigate through these big issues today. And I say this once again in this politically charged year, with ex-presidents being found guilty, and then sons of presidents finding themselves guilty, people on both sides clamoring for what they think is the right answer or who did something wrong. But let me just ask you this. For those that are not very well versed in these subjects, would you be kind enough to give us the definition in your mind of liberal democracy so we understand that clearly, which I think is a very important tenet in the book that we're talking about to understand it? How would you define that for those that may not have, a deeper education in this subject but are still interested?
Sure. Well, first of all, I would say that it's important to understand that liberal democracy is not just a set of institutions or practices like elections. These are all very important to democracy, But at the heart of liberal democracy is an ethical vision about the reconstitution of our public life oriented toward the expanded flourishing of more and more people. It is an ethical vision. Remember, at its founding, the great democratic revolutions of the 18th and 19th century rethought, reimagined what government could be without monarchs, without a powerful church structure wed to a monarchy. And so the idea of democracy was, again, this vision about reconstituting the public order, the political order, in ways that would expand freedom and justice and tolerance for more and more people. So first and foremost about liberal democracy is fundamentally a political order oriented toward securing freedom for its citizens. And it's rooted in ideals of political equality and a recognition that in the population there's going to be difference. And so toleration is also a central part of that ethical ideal. Freedom, primarily, equality, political equality, and toleration. So again, It's about ethics wed to a set of political institutions. As I like to say, liberal democracy is the political form of the humane ideal.
Wow. Very powerful stuff. And ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us on the Dr. Sky Experience, it's always great guest here. You're listening to me, Dr. Sky, on Talk Radio 77 WABC. Our producer, of course, extraordinaire, is Richard Dugan, Dr. D, performing the honors of making sure this sounds as good as it should with great guests. And today's very special guest is none other than Dr. James Davison Hunter. His brand new book that we're proud to talk about here is entitled Democracy and Solidarity on the Cultural Roots of America's Political Class by the Yale University Press. It's always a privilege to have you, sir, talking about these subjects. I would suggest that in the future, we might want to do this with your okay in a large audience type participation in a theater or some sort of a large auditorium on a Zoom screen, because I think with the short time that we have today, I would think that this whole subject needs much more time. But would you be even open to doing something like that, where you would take questions and commentary from the people in the audience?
I'd be happy to. It'd be a lot of fun.
Yes, sir. But here we go. Let's talk about this. And again, I say this to the people out there that may not have the background that you have, of course, in your expertise in education and your scholarly works. But solidarity, I mean, I kind of look at it this way: a framework of cohesion in which legitimate political debate and discourse and action takes place. But that might be a canned response to the definition of solidarity. How would you define that in the context of the book that you're writing and the message that you're getting out?
Well, look, every institution, from the family all the way up to the government, every institution, every society requires some kind of cohesion. There has to be some set of agreements or shared dispositions. Otherwise, institutions would not be governable. So every society requires some kind of we-ness among those who live within those institutions. And this is true of government itself. And indeed, we have our national motto, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. So What is the oneness? What is the we-ness that defines us? I don't use the word consensus because it biases our understanding toward rational agreement. I think the reason why I use the concept of solidarity instead is because part of our we-ness comes from a sense of shared hope, a sense of a common project, a sense of what is at stake. In spite of our differences, across our differences, we share those kinds of things. It's as much emotional and psychological as it is rational and cognitive. And if we're just talking about the cognitive, say, where every citizen knows the Bill of Rights or knows something about the Constitution, well, that's an important thing. But it's, in times of crisis, oftentimes we don't care whether someone is on the opposite political party. We just come together because we share something at stake. We share a common future. So a big part of this book is a story of what has happened to the cultural sources that bound us together as a nation. It was imperfect from the start. It contained contradictions within itself, and those contradictions were the promise of freedom, but then denying freedom to large swaths of the public, the promise of equality, the promise of justice, and yet, again, the denial of those things. So much of the history of American political culture has been this process of working through those contradictions, and in ways that changed our sense of unity, our sense of what it is that binds us together, but in ways that were still recognizable with the founding period. That, it seems to me, that period is now gone. We have exhausted those resources, and it leaves us in a situation, as you mentioned earlier, where we don't have the cultural resources to work through those divisions anymore, and as a consequence, we're divided over everything.
Wow, how sad, but how true in the reality world. But I guess I'd sum it up this way. See if you agree. The cultural resources we have that we're used to in the past to resolve social and political issues are no longer available. And you're describing that in your book. This is fascinating because, like I said, in short interviews like this, important as they are to both of us, I'm sure, and to our listeners, most important, it's one of these subjects that really needs to be at the forefront of every single person who's in school to understand that we should be able to live together and get along. Obviously, the golden rule concept, making life as good as it can be, where we respect everybody for who they are, not for what wealth they have or what the political side they're on. But it's a very interesting subject, but it requires, I think, a heck of a lot more time than we're allocated here for today. But I'd like, if you would be kind, Doctor, just to summarize the 14 chapters in the book, you bring up something very interesting, and I'll quote something directly from your book about what might be something that in the past or in the Civil War days, there might have been all this blight and no hope, but according to the quote that you have here, Frederick Douglass in July 5th, 1852, and I quote, "Notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. The arm of the Lord is not shortened. The doom of slavery is certain. I, therefore, leave off where I began with hope," end quote. Very appropriate to the subject of trying to correct the ills that you so well write about in society, and hoping that there's time and open minds to be able to come together. I think that would be the summation from my side. But you get the final word. What's the main key point? People should go ahead and get this book. What would they be exploring in the summation from you?
Well, I do believe that liberal democracy is the political form of the humane ideal, and though it is not perfect by a long shot, it has brought about over again struggle and time, more justice to more people, more equality to more people, and it is something worth fighting for. This is a book that explores the crisis of contemporary democracy in the attempt to understand the full measure of that crisis. We tend to think of it as something that can be fixed through this policy change or that policy change. It's not going to be. It's far deeper, far more significant. And until we understand the depth and complexity of this, it's going to be very hard to respond constructively in ways that can preserve it for following generations.
Well, absolutely. And we're missing something in this whole conversation, not by intention. But you also have another book, which I'll summarize very quickly, and have you, of course, the author, describe this main thesis, but the book entitled Before the Shooting Begins. How apropos in a world that many say are on the verge of civil war in this country and other places around the world. In that particular book, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. The main theme of that book, please describe to us in simple terms, what is that all about?
Well, the story is very simple. Democracy, whatever else it may be, is an agreement that we're not going to kill each other over our differences.
Yes.
This is why culture wars often precede shooting wars. There was a 30-year culture war leading up to the Civil War, and the whole point is that culture provides the justifications for violence. That's why they proceed. They don't necessarily end in a civil war or in violence, but you never have violent conflict without cultural preconditions being there, again, because it provides the justifications for violence. I don't anticipate that we're going to be in a civil war. In the late modern, postmodern world, violence tends to be more like terrorism than kind of full division of a nation. But I do think that we are in a fragile moment in history, and there's an awful lot at stake. And this book was written in the attempt to clarify the kind of confusing moment that we're in, so that we could see clearly what is at stake and how we might address it.
Well, Doc, you say it so well in the book, of course, Democracy and Solidarity on the Cultural Roots of America's Political Crisis. Not to be funny in any way, shape, or form for humor, but we hope that the often used expression, why simply can't we all just get along, hopefully has more meaning in our modern day society with real teeth in that, so that we can calm ourselves down and try to come together, as you describe here with solutions in your book. Privilege and honor to have you, Doctor, as we go to the hard break at the bottom of the hour. That concludes this interesting interview. As you folks tell us, email me at drskyshow@gmail.com, and you're listening to Talk Radio 77 WABC. We call it the crown jewel of radio, simply the iconic 77. Talk Radio WABC, beaming out of New York City, the nation, the world, and the cosmos. Normal topics are the great science subjects of astronomy, space, aviation, and weather, stories of American exceptionalism, and musical guests and celebrities in the mix. Thank you, Dr. James Davison Hunter, for your talk with us.
Thank you.